Hello, and welcome to the 17th Annual Town History Series. I'm Jill Pickett-Roy, the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian for the Saginaw History and Genealogy Room at Patent Free Library. This is the second of 5 presentations in the Town History Series, presented on Zoom and Bath Community Television for the first time this year. The Town History Series is hosted jointly by Patent Free Library and Bath Historical Society. And I'd like to thank our financial sponsor for this event, White Mountain Wealth Management of Raymond James, as well as our presenters and their local historical societies. The 17th Annual Town History Series is dedicated to the memory of Russell Malone and Dr. Charles Burton. I'd like to take a moment today to tell you a little bit more about Charlie Burton, who passed away on December 26, 2020, at the age of 87. Charlie was born on August 25, 1933, in Bath, where he attended Morse High School. He studied at Harvard Medical School before returning to Bath to practice pediatric medicine. Later, Charlie was instrumental in founding the Bath Marine Museum, now known as Maine Maritime Museum. Beyond that, Charlie's impact on the history field cannot be understated. He collected and donated many thousands of items to museums, libraries, and archives, including the Patent Free Library. We owe him a huge debt, and this is just a small acknowledgement of his contribution. Over the years, Charlie presented 3 talks for the Town History Series, all of which are available to check out on DVD. Both Charlie Burton and Russell Malone are representative of the amazing level of knowledge and professionalism and public-spiritedness that favors this wonderful community, qualities that the Town History Series celebrates year after year. I want to go over a few technical details. We will conduct a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using Zoom's Q&A feature. You can type in your questions for the presenter at any time during the presentation. If you need to communicate with me or my co-host, Jack Martin, about any audio-visual issues, please use the Zoom chat function. If we don't answer your questions today, or if you would like to discuss the presentation further, we will hold an informal follow-up session with the speaker this Tuesday, January 26th, I believe. Let's check that. Yeah, it's the 26th. That'll be at 4 p.m. If you haven't registered to receive links for the whole series by email, you must do so on our website in order to participate in the follow-up session. Our speaker today is a fairly new resident of Arrowsic, and after 45 years in Maine, he still refers to himself as from away. As you'll hear, he was inspired to study local history when he found an old cemetery close to his house. He's connected to maritime history through his service as an officer aboard the USS Sampson and through his volunteer role as a tour guide in the Percy Small Shipyard at Maine Maritime Museum. I'm very pleased to welcome Jack Carr today. Jack, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for all of you to join me on this wonderful day we're having in Maine today. Bright, sunny day in the 30s. You know, I don't have to tell you, we live in historic times. We've been told we study history so as not to repeat it. I'm not quite sure that's true. I think to not repeat means everything has to stay the same, and nothing stays the same. I think we all know that. But to understand the nature of why we study history, I think my old economics professor once said about economics, and I think it holds for history, is that it's to understand the past with greater and greater accuracy. And what I find most interesting about the study of history is that when you get into it, all sorts of mysteries come up that you would have thought had been solved many years ago. And I'll be bringing up a few, at least 4 or 5 mysteries during this presentation. And I hope I got the answers right. But if I don't, you'll be knowing how to reach me at the end of this. So please join me in any active activities you'd like to tell me about the history of our area. But before we proceed, I'd like a few ground rules here. boundaries have to be established in history because history goes back a long time. And I think we're going to stick with just the historical record. As much as I'd like to talk about some of the oral and things that were talked around the campfires, such as the Abenakis going out in frail canoes and spearing swordfish off of Georgetown and bringing them home as trophies. I'd love to hear about those stories, but there's no written word about it, so we're going to skip those tales. But as Jill said, in full disclosure, I am from away, was raised in Chicago on the north side, so that brings a burden on me because I'm all confused from an orientation for many times since I've been to Maine, because in Chicago, everything's north and south. You get on a corner in Chicago, you know it's north. You know Lake Michigan's always to your right. But in Maine, it's not that way. Maine is not a north-south state. Maine is a west-east state. And once you get a handle of that, then things make a lot more sense. But we'll be talking about that a little bit more. And also, as Jill mentioned, I've only been in Arrowsic for 4 years now. I've driven through Arrowsic many years before, but I don't think I understood it until I really got into this history. So with that in mind, I'd like to spend some time orienting you because I know many are on this presentation tonight out there. They have no idea where Arrowsic is. They don't know its beautiful past. And I think you need to know geographically where it is and why it fits in the surprising things we're going to find they did not teach you in grammar school about history, about this area of the country. At least I'm hoping you all learned something new today. This is on the left is, of course, an orientation of where the state of Maine is, up in the right-hand corner of the country. And that you also notice the squiggly blue line that runs through both those green panels there. And that's the Kennebec River, one of the biggest rivers in the country, certainly one of the biggest in Maine. It flows all the way 170 miles, all the way from Moosehead Lake down to the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Maine. When it gets down to Bath and even south of Augusta, it's a tidal river. And those in the Midwest, I don't have a clue what that means, is that that river goes both directions, south and north, north and south. And if you don't believe that, just go out on a day like today where you see the ice flow out there. If you see an iceberg floating down the river, wait a while and it'll come back. It's just the way these rivers work. And that's part of this history of why things happened the way they did. And the other interesting thing I think you're going to find is that Arrowsic sits right in the middle of the river. Matter of fact, the word Arrowsic is an Abenaki word for stick in the river or obstruction in the river, because that's what it is. It is surrounded by 3 rivers, the Kennebec River, the Saginaw River, and the Back River on its south side. The panel on the right, where the star is, that's where Arrowsic is, in reference to where you can see down below the entrance to the river. As you can see where the blue is in that panel, in that navigational chart, it's a fractured landscape, to say the least. And it was caused by erosion of the rivers, but probably just as important, it was caused by the retreating of the glaciers a long time ago, leaving the scars and these passages for the rivers to continue their erosion. And that is created the history of this state, because if you notice, not only is the Kennebec River going north and south, so is most of that water that you see going north and south. It created a tremendous barrier and a natural barrier between the east and the west, which has been a major part of the history of Maine. This is on the left, you see a high altitude aerial shot of Arrowsic. And Arrowsic is right there in the center. That's Sewell Pond for reference points. Bath is right here. And when you look at it from this point of view, you get a better sense that this is truly an island. There's the Back River I talked about earlier. And on the right-hand panel, I put it in green because I think it's apropos, it should be green. Arrowsic is covered with a forest. It has got, if it isn't forest, it's a marsh. If it isn't a marsh, it's maybe an open meadow, but it's very green. There's no industry to speak of. It is a beautiful island to look at from any direction you look at it. It only has a population today of a stable population, about 450 people, and that's almost on purpose. It's a long island, 10 miles long. It's only a mile across, it's skinny, 5,000 acres. And that has made up a lot to do with why we're talking today about the history of it. Some of these mysteries I'm going to be talking about is, well, we already talked about where Arrowsic is, but why is Arrowsic important to even talk about, especially regarding maritime issues? And why are we going to talk about that Arrowsic features the biggest things and the smallest things in Maine, such as the smallest things? We have the smallest post office that now is closed, but we also had the biggest industrial complex in the state of Maine for a while. And then, as Jill mentioned, I got into it originally 4 years ago when I bought a piece of property on the river in Kennebec. It had a cemetery, and I started looking into the cemetery, trying to figure out who's buried there, and that brought up a lot of questions. And so I did research. This map is a zoning map, and it kind of indicates to me how the layout of the lots were back in the day. We won't be spending much time on that because we want to focus on the water. It's all about water today, by the way. But you should know that the Abenakis called it, as I said, Arrowsic, but the Europeans, for whatever reason, they were probably pretty good at math. Maybe they were good at reading, but they were lousy at spelling, because every time I looked at a document, Arrowsic was spelled differently. And these are just some of the, as an example of some of the spellings of Arrowsic. This is all going to start in the 17th century, this presentation, and that presents the first mystery as far as I'm concerned. The first major settlement, it was north of Boston. It was the largest settlement east and north of Boston. If you can, in the 17th century, if you can imagine that, forget Portsmouth, all the big cities of Portland. Arrowsic was the largest of the, what I would call the industrial age. The entire island was almost be called a factory. And what's odd about that, even though it was the largest commercial and industrial enterprise on the Kennebec, today, you won't find any of that. There is absolutely no visible industrialization of Arrowsic. There's no retail or offices, no stores, no strip malls, no gas stations, no schools, no churches, even though the first schools and churches were here. No public boat ramps, no access for the public to get the boat in the water, no public wharfs for fishermen to pull up to. It's totally covered by trees. As a matter of fact, it has the whole research forest here, a relatively well-known nationally forest research area, but there's nothing else other than people and trees for the most part. And my wife calls it, and also chipmunks. We have a lot of them. Going back to the original people, we had what they call the red clay people, then the Abenakis, which we're going to hear more about. Norsemen are reported to have here the artifacts showing where they came up the Kennebec are slim, if any. Georgetown has a good history of some of that. You might want to look into it. Interesting enough, the Basques, the fishermen out of Bay of Biscayne on the Spanish and French coast there, when John Cabot came over for the first European explorer, he saw a lot of Basque fishermen out there feeding Europe for cod that they caught here right on our borders. I find that amazing. The Basques were here before a lot of people. But then, of course, some of the European explorers came. They're founding by different countries over in Europe. And then I say one of the major explorers in terms of the Kennebec is Champlain. He's a French explorer. He spent most of his time up in St. Croix and the St. Lawrence River area, but he did come down here, and in 1607, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that's when he made a big emphasis, when he actually made maps and charts, because he was a wonderful chart maker, and that really opened up this whole coast of Maine. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the first colony in New England, which is the Popham colony. So that's how it all began. The map on the left is kind of like a hand-drawn chart. That was done by the Champlain I just mentioned. And you can see almost in the center here, his ship, where he parked his ship. Now, keep in mind, anybody that sailed on the coast of Maine, how these explorers ever found the mouth of a river is amazing, because you go off a half a mile, quarter mile off the coast, and you look at the coast, all you see is one string line of cliffs and trees. You don't see open river area. How they managed to find these in those big ships they were sailing, but they did. But he made this chart, very accurate chart. You see there's Popham over here, Popham area, and Phippsburg over here. This is Georgetown over here. And of course, this is the river with the depth marking going up the river. There's Atkins Cove, right? Cox Head over here. But more interesting, I think, is take a look at the panel to the right. That's a modern navigational chart, right? And if you look at it, you'll see almost the same markings everywhere. You've got down here where you can see where it's at B, that's Sequin Island. And up above it is Pond Island. And you'll see those same islands over here. So when the mariners were coming up the river, they saw this, but if you didn't need GPS to get up the river if you had one of these kind of charts. I think it's amazing that 1607, he can create a chart like that. I mean, he didn't have GPS. He didn't have all the modern techniques we have today. So anyway, I think that's important to see something like that. What he did, though, which was truly amazing, is in that big boat, he carried with him some longboats for exploration close to the shore, because you can't take a big boat up the river easily or get close to the shore, or even get on shore with a big ship. So he brought these, what they call longboats, and they were probably looking like this. He also, because he was French, they got together with the Indians a lot more than the English. And the Indians, the Abenakis, were friends of the French, and they acted as guides. So Champlain got in this type of a boat, and maybe with canoes following him, with some guides, Indian guides, and he asked, show me the river. Show me how Kennebec works. And that's what they did. And he circumnavigated our island of Arrowsic, right? You'll notice on the left panel, the red lines, that was his route. And starting at the mouth of the river, he went up the back river. You can see this. There's a little record about what he did after he got up to Hognock Bay. Some people say he went up to Wiscasset up here, but he did come back and retraced his route, went up the Cenotaph River, which back in the day was not cleared like it is today. And by the way, this slide over to the side over here on the right, that is the back river, which is the south end of Arrowsic. You'll see Arrowsic on the right side and Georgetown on the left. But anyway, back to the Cenotaph River. You went up the Cenotaph River underneath what today would be where the Green Bridge is, through the path between Woolwich and the north end of Arrowsic, which is called Preble Point. He continued up the Kennebec River, up through Merry Meeting up in this area, and then back down the Kennebec River, circumnavigating the entire island and headed back to his ships, which as you can see is here again, right? What happened when he published these charts and he made it more visible to the outside world, it opened the door to the Popham colonies being established here when they trundled into this area. And I think they may or may not have used these charts. Probably they didn't, because he was probably heading back to Europe when they explored through this area of the Popham colony area. But as you can see where that arrow points, that's where the two ships, the Mary John and the Grace, showed up, and they dumped their colonists right there to form a colony to get them through the winter. What happened, though, is somewhat tragic. Captain George Popham was captain of the Gift of God, and Captain Raleigh Popham, Gilbert, excuse me, was the captain of the Mary John. But Gilbert died very shortly after he got on this island, or on that area where you see the area. And he died at 76. So he was a pretty sturdy guy being on an exploration like this with all those young men. And they got through a pretty tough winter. And I always thought maybe it was the winter that made this Popham colony collapse and dissolve away. And keep in mind, this is 1607. What also happened in 1607? Put up your hand. No, there, you. It's Jamestown. Jamestown down near south of Richmond, Virginia. That was also founded in 1607. And that's the one you probably remember was the first settlement in the United States. And Jamestown lasted a bit longer. Popham Colony didn't make it for a full year, and that's why you don't see it in the history book. But they both started in the same year. When their relief ship came back in the spring, that was the Mary John, the colonists were pretty discouraged. For one reason, they just lost one of their leaders. But more importantly, with the Mary John, when it came back to recover and bring tools to start the colony for the next year, reported that Gilbert's, one of his relatives died, leaving the entire estate and fortune to him. And he said, I'd rather go back to the UK and enjoy my riches, I guess, and announced to everybody he's going back. And when he went back and they didn't have their other leader, the entire colony kind of said, well, if we don't have any leadership, we're going back too. So it was a matter of loss of leadership rather than weather that forced the colony to close. And they got on 2 boats. One was this Mary John, that was the relief ship. But the other one, and this is an interesting story in itself, when the colonists first got there were some good shipwrights on board, and they built a ship called the Virginia of the Saginaw. And the Virginia was a very good boat they built. They used local materials, and it was what they call a pinnace. And there it is right there. The Virginia, and it was 30 tons and 50 foot long. The model on the right, which you can look at the Maine Maritime Museum, that's sort of a lateen rig. You can see the mast and the spar there. Basically an open boat. That's what took them away from Popham Colony back to the UK safely. When they got back to the UK, it was still in pretty good shape, so they rebuilt it, put a deck on it, and built it looking somewhat to the right. And I say somewhat because nobody to this day knows what these boats look like. These are boats of the period, but they're probably what they look like. And if you notice, the one on the left has fore and aft sails, kind of like today's modern sloops, but the one on the right has some square rig sails. And that's because they were doing transatlantic, which is a better type of sail pattern sometimes when you need certain types of winds going across the Atlantic. That boat on the right went back, not to Popham, but went to Jamestown and back and forth a couple of times. So we don't know how it ended. Another point I'll make, where it says 30 tons, forget what that means, because tonnage, the word ton means many things to many people. I think there's like 29 definitions of the word ton. It's basically started with the barrels of wine or barrels of water and what a ton of a barrel was. But usually when we're talking tons, we are talking about capacity inside the hull. We are not talking about displacement weight. That gets people confused, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because it does get confusing. These are some key dates, and we're not going to go through every single date, but these are the dates when John Cabot first, there was an Englishman, actually he was Italian if I recall, but his name sounds English, was cruising the coast, and then Champlain, multiple voyages of him, Popham Colony. You can read this at your leisure. The key thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that what changed Arrowsic around happened in 1654. And 1654 is when 2 gentlemen, 2 very good businessmen, one named Major Clark, and by the way, the Clark should be spelled with an E at the end of it, and Captain Lake. They were 2 businessmen down in Boston. They were merchants, and they had a vision, a grand vision, and they put up a lot of capital and eventually bought Arrowsic. They bought it from some of the people that owned little bits of it. The Indians, of course, owned some of it back in the past. One of the major sachems or chiefs was named Robin Hood. He sold some of the rights to the land, which was the start of some of the problems you're going to be hearing about. Because when Indians were selling the land, they thought they were selling the rights to use the land. You could hunt deer, that sort of thing. They didn't realize they were actually selling the land. And that caused a lot of problems in the future, which we'll get into. This book here talks a lot about what Clark and Lake did and accomplished. This is going to be one of the mysteries. One of the mysteries that I came across is, here again, outlined in yellow is the island. Question I had is, why did they, keep in mind, this is totally covered with trees. Everything is covered with trees all around them. Why in the world would they put this headquarters of their operations, which were going to be very large and controlling a lot of land mass, why were they going to put their operation on this little corner of the island off a little stream called the Upper Hellgate, which is a very wild piece of water? Why would they do that? Well, whenever you look at some of these mysteries in history, and for that matter, if you were looking at a building, you wanted to say what was wrong with the building, the answer 85% of the time is water in one of its forms, either solid, ice, steam, or liquid in this case. So answer of this mystery is water. If you were to look at this map, you kind of always think of today, looking at a modern map, roads going everywhere, bridges going everywhere. But back in the day, there were no bridges or roads. It was solid woods that you could barely penetrate. So the reason they went there was that if you look at it, they looked at it with Indian eyes, or maybe even seagull eyes, because it is the center of everything. From where that arrow points, they could go north, up the Saginaw, through under the Green Bridge into the, just like Champlain did, go up the Kennebec, go 170 miles. They could even get up to Canada that way. Or they could go south in the back river or the Kennebec down to the ocean and go off to Europe. They could go to the right, which is east. They could go into Sheepscot River. They could go over to Booth Bay Harbor. They could go up to Damariscotta. They could stay without going out into the open ocean any direction they want. This was the center of the universe. It's like what they used to call the Chicago or Boston when there was the hub of all railroads. This was the hub of the whole region. That's why they put it there. It was all about the rivers. They were the highways that the Indians used on their canoe routes, but it was also what the Europeans used for their hunting of fur and finding timber and other resources this land had to offer. The other major reason is that, though it doesn't show on this map, it's right next to what they call Spring Cove. Spring Cove is the largest freshwater source at that time. And if you're going to start a large colony with a lot of people and you're going to have livestock, you better have fresh water. So Spring Cove, and they probably got this idea talking to the guide Indians, that this was a good place to put their headquarters. The headquarters are kind of interesting. On the right is a plan of what their headquarters looked like. The biggest building is called the Mansion, and the archaeological records showed what they did here, and they did many things there. They had they had blacksmith shops, they had a shipyard, they had 2 different tidal mills, one for grist, one for lumber. They had cooper shops, they had bakeries. They even had a large palisade with 2 cannons. This was a mini city right here. Right next to, you notice Spring Cove right above it, where the freshwater sources were. But today, if you went back there, and if you notice the picture on your left, I took that picture 2 weeks ago. That's what it looks like today. It looks like the woods. You see the Saginaw River through the trees. It's amazing. If it isn't made of stone, it goes back to dust. So you can't find anything. And please believe me, people have been looking for it. I'm sure they've dug down in there, found some shattered pottery and a few other things, but they didn't find a lot. Whereas like when you go to Europe and you see ancient towns, everything was built of stone and granite. That still survives thousands of years. But in the forests of Maine and forests of New England, everything's built of wood, and it doesn't take much for it to go back to nature. It's an important point to note. So that's why they built it there, and it was a fascinating thing. Now here's how this place all ended, though. In 1676, right, they were having sort of troubles with the Indians, and Clark and Lake were very smart, so they got the Indians together. They had a party. They were all having a good time. The night after that, though, some Indians came across the Saginaw River on your panel to the left and invaded and burned down the whole place. There was apparently one of the lady Indians in there was opened up the door for the war party and got in. Everybody escaped. Now Clark and Lake shared responsibilities for this enterprise. So alternate years, Clark would be there or Lake would be there. This particular year, Lake had the bad luck of being there when the Indians attacked. He got out the back door, I guess, and you can see, and the panel to the right shows where he escaped across Palace Cove, past Mill Island there where the trees are, over to almost the horizon. That's Georgetown. It was called Parker Island back in the day. And the Indians caught up with him and killed him, and 2 or 3 of his other escapees, you might say. That all happened in 1676. And from that point on, things got worse. One of the problems in the following year is, that is an interesting story in itself, is you can see the photograph on the left, or the painting of the left, that mural there. That's Sir William Phipps. He has a fascinating story. He was a poor boy living on the other side of the Saginaw. He came across in a canoe one day and worked for Clark and Lake, become a carpenter. They liked what he did. He eventually went down to Boston, became a shipwright, came back, set up his own boatyard, built some boats for Clark and Lake. But then in 1677, when he was one of his first boats, he was putting timber on it, the Indians attacked again. The settlers were panicking. In his generosity, he threw all the timber off of his boat, put the settlers on his boat, and they drifted past down the Saginaw into Hockomock Bay and eventually in the Sheepscot, eventually went down to Boston. and that's when he became a star. He was a hero down there. He became governor of all of Massachusetts, which was a big deal. He made his fortune treasure hunting down the Caribbean. Eventually, the King of England brought him over to London, where he was knighted. I mean, so he was he made a name for himself. During that same time, though, you know, we're talking about the Europeans settling and building ships for themselves and fishing and whatever else they were doing on the water. What about the Indians? Well, you know, when the Indians captured a lot of these settlements, what else did they capture? Some of these fishing boats. They had literally a fleet of fishing boats to their disposal. Many of the Indians didn't know how to use one of these European boats, but they would have some Europeans training them, and they would go up and down raiding the coast of New England. They went as far south as Wells and other places. Matter of fact, they were planning to invade Boston at one time, but they just didn't have the manpower to man all the boats they owned. Another settlement issue that was an important element for Arrowsic was Newtown. This Newtown was established down on the south end of the island right after these first attacks. And you can see that it's only a couple of years later in 1679. And 65 settlers first settled up. Here again, they only built a few foundations out of stone. So if you walk this trail, which I've done, you're not going to find much. I've noticed a few foundations, but not much. And then you see the Newtown Cemetery to the right. But here again, a few years go by, 10 years go by, and it was burned to the ground. And this was a continuing process along the Kennebec because it was the boundary of east and west. To the east, where the English settled, but to the west, I mean, to the east was where the French settled. They call it New France. And to the west, which is, I would like to think of as south, that's where the English settled. So it was a demarcation zone. They were building forts up and down the Kennebec River to save themselves from the Indian attacks during the French and Indian Wars. So this Newtown was burned as well. And the red square there shows where Newtown was located. It was a fishing village. Why they would put it there, I don't know, but they did, and it lasted quite a while. But it was purchased, as you can see, the map's going to give you a sense of where it was when it was purchased, and to this day, it's not there. You'll never find it other than a few stones on top of each other. I put this in here just to give a little more sense of what happened on the Kennebec. Keep in mind, the rivers are the highway of New England back in the day. So when the Revolutionary War started, Washington ordered Benedict Arnold, remember him? He was ordered to go up to Canada, to Quebec, and invade Canada as part of because they were part of the English during the Revolutionary War. They wanted to kind of, I guess, tweak the British nose. So they started off down in Massachusetts, where you see on the left here, the A. They went up to New Hampshire, B as a staging area, then went across the Gulf of Maine and got to the mouth of the Kennebec River. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up was that one of their stops was Arrowsic. That's when they had a church, and Newtown was there, and Benedict Arnold got there, and matter of fact, in his logbook, he talked about going to church there in Arrowsic. And in that cemetery, we saw a Newtown cemetery, supposedly, I had never seen it, but there's a gravestone of one of the bodyguards for George Washington. So it's kind of strange how that worked out. Speaking of graveyards, this is what got me started in all this. This is in my backyard. This is called the Friedman Spinny Cemetery. Captain Samuel Freeman, you can see to the right where those two stones are here. And these stones are in perfect condition. They're all granite. They're not like slate stones or stones that wear with time. These are in perfect condition. You can read them from a distance. He sailed a couple of schooners, probably more than this. I listed the ships that he sailed. And that is his wife, Elmira. She was a Stinton, by the way. I say that only because a year before he married her, he had married the mother of many of his children, Mary Stinton, who died. They were both sisters. They lived on the Stinton farm. You may recognize the old Stinton farm. You remember where Clark Lake is? I showed you on the other side of the island. Well, the old Stinson farm took that land over when Clark Lake abandoned it. And that has been the oldest continuous farm in Arrowsic, over 200 years old. And this is other graves, other markers in my, as you see, the Spinnies, the Stinsons, the Freedmans, these are all very well-known names on Arrowsic. The one on the right, though, is particularly interesting. That's Nicholas Spinny. Now, Nicholas Spinny is, his name Spinny is very famous for tidal mills and other things that in Arrowsic. And this started one of the mysteries. The mystery that I found most intriguing was in between those two stones, what's called a cenotaph. You may never have heard that before, but it's basically not a gravestone marking the body, but rather a memorial stone marking an event. And unfortunately, the top part of the stone was broken off, not revealing his name. And all it says in the inscription below is this, the lost son at sea back in 1843. He was only 25 years old. So I went to the Georgetown Historical Society, their records, went through all their cemetery, and they have extensive records. And it was listed that the person that should have been marked on this stone was H.H. Spinny. But then when I did more research, I found out that H.H. Spinny died a few years later, and it was not a he, it was a she. It was Harrietta Spinny. So that got me thinking, well, who is buried in my backyard? So I eventually figured it out after more research that it was William H. Freeman. That's that Captain Freeman we looked at earlier before. So that's kind of one of the mysteries that I came across. And as I said, it was kind of interesting to find that sort of thing. But let's now talk about get back to water. I think that's more interesting. We're surrounded by water. That's a day marker on Ram Island in the middle of the Kennebec River, Phippsburg in the background. We have lighthouses, we have range lights. We have the upper Hellgate, which are rapids, unbelievable rapids. We have, once again, modern maps that show lighthouses on Sequin Island, which you're probably all familiar with, and Pond Island. These are photographs of what they look like now. These are paintings of what happens when you don't pay attention to these markers. Bad things happen. All kinds of legends of ghost ships are out there. You can see on these pictures, both Sequin and Pond Island portrayed. This is a chart showing where these various lighthouses are up and down the river. But when you get in the river, the first lighthouse you'll see is Squirrel Point. You'll see all these lighthouse towers look identical because they're all from the same identical design. You see the keeper's house up there. This lighthouse is a little odd in that, notice the red in the planes of glass. If you saw red, that's not good because it's tinted glass, because when the light swivels around and it goes through it and shows red on the river, that's not a good place to be. You want to be where it's white on the river. This is an interesting point of interest. As you get up the river, you get to an area called Fiddler's Reach. We're going to be talking about that a little bit. This is where I sort of live up in this general area. The arrows show where there's a range light system and then the famous doubling point light. Back in 1891, over 3,000 vessels passed this point. Imagine that, 3,000 vessels, especially if you're familiar with the river today, how little traffic there is there. And that doesn't even count the daily steamers and the boats that go back and forth all the time. So I did more research. Now, let's go back a second. Take a look at that shape of Fiddler's Reach. You see how there's kind of like an S shape? Take a look at this. This is a map of the Thames River. I was told when I first moved in, the reason it's called Fiddler's Reach is that a drunk fiddler off the back of a boat drowned, falling off the back, and they never found the body. Well, it's always only half true. The real truth is that event happened in the Thames River. And if you look at a blow up I got to the right, it's the same shape as Doubling Point. You see Fiddler's Reach, and guess what? Up here, that's Long Reach, the same Long Reach you see on today's charts. And this is what it looks like today, modern Fiddler's Reach. And these lighthouses are really fascinating. These are all been turned over by the Coast Guard to private organizations, nonprofits that are taking care of it, and they've done a wonderful job. These range lights are like beacons that you line up on. Right now, I've got them offset so you can see them, but one is in the trees in the woods back there, a little bit higher than the other one, and they're 500 feet apart. So when you're coming down the river from south to north, they line up with one on top of each other, and you know you're in the center of the canal. The keepers of these lights would go up and down these pathways of elevated wood and go from one lighthouse to another along this stretch of Fiddler's Reach. This shows what it was like in the past. If you notice above those kids' heads, these are elevated walkways. You can see them. And you can see right here, back in 1968, they were still there. They were removed in the 70s, and where this red lines are, that's where this used to be. So they completely removed the elevated walkway, so you can't walk that today. It's all grown in. This is the famous doubling point light that all tour guides show off. Once again, you'll notice the towers are almost identical. And you'll see that the a tour boat from the museum's going by. This is a fascinating, this is a fog bell they put in. The reason they put this fog bell in, you can see the bell there, is that that ship to the right struck that point of land. And then 2 years later, they put in a fog bell to stop that from ever happening again. And I got a male model showing off the bell. And this is the inside of the tower, which very few people have ever seen. They had ferry boats going back and forth across the river. They were very kind of crude back in the old days. And one of the ferry boats was right down here near Fisher Eddy. And then to your left of the flagpole, that's the Kennebec River. To the right is Fisher Eddy, and that's Bluff Head. They had all kinds of different kinds of ferries going back and forth. These are ferries from Bath. They carried both cars and trains. Here's a train going in the terminal. This is down by the supermarket in Bath parking lot. And then there's a train, there's a various types of tour boats. There's their motley crew. I took this picture down in Mystic Seaport. This is one of the tour boats that was traveling back in the 20s up and down the Kennebec River. And they'd even go up the Cenotaph through the upper Hell Gates and lower Hell Gates. You can imagine that going up there. Bridges, of course, are very important. This is the bridge to Arrowsic from Woolwich. And now, of course, we have the Saginaw Bridge from Bath to Woolwich, as well as the Carleton Bridge that were built in those years. And my favorite bridge was a famous engineer. This is a cantilever steel bridge on concrete piles. I affectionately just call it the Green Bridge, and everybody knows where the Green, but it's actually called the Max Weiler Bridge. Earlier bridges, before Max Weiler built this bridge, were these contraptions that had a drawbridge kind of effect that boats could get through it. It was not built well, and you could just look at it and say, would I ever want to go across that bridge? But it fell down in 1919 and made a panic around here because everybody, including Georgetown, couldn't get to shore. But eventually they rebuilt it to the bridge it is today. At the south end of Arrowsic, there's also what I'd call a modern bridge going across, once again, the back river to the right. Mills were important back in the day. Tidal mills. Tidal mills are what they would do is when the tide would rise up maybe 9 or 10 feet, it would fill up the pond behind the mill. They closed the gate, and then they'd let the water out when the tide was going out, and it would turn the wheels for either lumber or grist mill. It was a reciprocal saw, went up and down, took forever. The sawyers used to be able to go out hunt rabbits and come back later while the same log was cutting. It took a long time.
Jack, this is your 2-minute warning.
2-minute warning, okay. Well, Crosby Mill was on the Sansanoa side. This is the only thing remaining of that. There's the entrance gate where it was, and then the pilings. You can see these pilings where the wharfs where they loaded lumber on barges to make homes along the area. The Spinny Mill was an interesting one. That's another tidal mill. There's almost 100,000 board feet. This is right on the right there on the Kennebec River, right where this red arrow points. Now, back to the cemetery again. If you look through the trees, you see the river. I often wondered why they put the cemetery in the middle of the woods. Well, there were no woods back in there. It's because the whole island was cleared. And it's where that blue arrow is. And Mr. Spinny here could look down from his grave and see Spinny Mill, which was located right here where the red arrow is. That was one of the mysteries I was trying to solve. And here is the viewing the mill from the water. And this is what it looks like today on the right side. That's a typical mill pound, and that's a gear that it's metal, and therefore it survived. Anything that's wood, of course, is rotted away a long time. Ice was a big deal. They would cut ice out of there, send this ice all over the world, down to the Caribbean, even to Bombay. Ice from Kennebec River served cocktails all over. They cut the ice with these tools. These tools you can actually see at the museum, Maritime Museum. And ice was a big deal back in those days. These guys made a fortune on ice. It didn't last long because of refrigeration and pollution of the river in the 1900s. Running logs was a big deal. Logs were run all the way till 1971 that was ended because trucks got so good and the roads got so good. But let's take a look at a quick glance of the ships that were built. There was one-masted ships, there were two-masted ships. The schooners that are fore and aft rig The model there showing on the right, that's called the Arrowsic, by the way, built in 1841, carried timber. It sank off Block Island off of Rhode Island many years after it was built. But of course, there's the square riggers that you're mostly familiar with. But to haul freight such as coal, which was a big commodity, you needed a schooner that could go up and down the coast because 4.5 rig sails were much better for sailing on the coast, and they were much less expensive to build and man because you had very few men on these ships, relatively speaking, compared to a square rigger. And there's a ship being launched at the location of the Perry and Small shipyard, and there's a diorama of what that shipyard looks like. Fascinating industry. It what made Bath what it is today. And there's a fascinating picture. I just got this from the museum showing a tugboat pulling 4 schooners up and down the river. You can't sail down the river. You got to use power. And that, because that brought the age of steam and then the evolution of the fighting ships. These are destroyers, the white ship maybe that was in the White Fleet. And there's a modern Arleigh Burke. BIW in 1894 started building steel ships. And that made BIW what it is today. And here's a picture just recently of one of the boats going out for sea trials, going around the, we can't see it because of my face is in the way, but they're going around Doubling Point and then heading out to sea. So this is a modern Arleigh Burke ship. But then we also have the state-of-the-art ships they're building there. You can see these on the docks right now at BIW. By the way, that boat is in Fiddler's Reach right now. It has a depth of underneath it, 95 feet of water under that boat in the middle of our river. So these rivers are pretty deep. And of course, we respect the past. The museums around here preserve the marine history. This is the Mary E. It's a tour boat out of the museum. You can see the bow. This is an interesting picture because you see the bow of the Mary E. In front of it, you see the Mary Meeting tour boat, but you can't see it, but behind that is BIW. So here is a bibliography if anybody's interested in learning more about this sort of thing. I make this, and I gave you my email address in case anybody would like to send me some information or something that I said that they didn't agree with, which is probably true. But I really enjoyed presenting this to you. And that's a beautiful picture of the sun going down over Doubling Point Light. And it's not that cold today. Well, thank you very much for listening to me.